What if a fading Hollywood actor's political career began with a single speech that changed everything? I'm Felix. Welcome to Felix Feel World. Leaders elected in Western countries all need to be really good at public speaking. It's kind of like entertainment. Reagan fit what voters wanted. This good-looking guy on TV, he could talk, so they picked him. With that one powerful speech, Reagan made an incredible comeback in politics. Before joining World War II, Reagan's movie career was doing pretty well. King's Row Times showed him he could move from a B-list actor to an A-lister. But after the war, Reagan went back to Hollywood in his 40s. His popularity tanked. He couldn't compete with all the young faces. The movies he starred in lost money left and right. The studio started to hate him. And finally the films that were supposed to be his were given to other male stars. Reagan got really angry about it, and he started clashing with Warner Bros. In 1952, Reagan handed over the Union president job to Walter, and after that he couldn't make it in Hollywood anymore. Back then, Reagan was making over $1 million a year, but it was also the time when the US had the heaviest taxes on high-income earners. 90% of Reagan's income went to taxes. Since that was a Democratic policy, Reagan began to hate the Democratic Party. His whole family had always supported, and his heart started leaning toward the Republicans. After leaving Hollywood, his agent got him a job on a TV show sponsored by General Electric. Reagan worked for GE for 8 years, until his contract ended in 1962. The reason they split was because Reagan was getting too deep into politics. In 1962, during a speech, Reagan said he really liked the Republican Party's views. A woman asked, "Aren't you a Democrat? Why don't you register as a Republican?" Reagan said, "I plan to do that." The woman stood up and said, "I'm a Republican registrar." She walked right up and handed Reagan a registration form. Reagan signed it and became a Republican from then on. In October 1964, Republican candidate Goldwater was running for governor in California. He wanted someone who had switched from the Democrats to help him campaign and win over Democratic fans. No one was better for that role than Reagan. And then Reagan's years of speaking experience exploded on stage. He gave the speech that made him famous nationwide, A Time for Choosing. He raised $1 million on the spot. There was so much money that even after Goldwater lost, they hadn't spent it all. That speech changed Reagan's life. He'd only been a Republican for 2 years and had never held any public office. But suddenly, he became the most popular Republican. His two main ideas, small government at home, strong defense abroad, really resonated with the American people. Goldwater wanted a sidekick to make himself look good, but the sidekick became the star. The main guy ended up as the sidekick instead. Goldwater? He probably cried into the toilet bowl. Reagan got famous fast for 2 reasons. First, he had years of speaking experience. From his childhood, influenced by his parents, he started performing on stage early. He knew how to tell stories. Then his time as a sports announcer and in Hollywood polished his skills, so he had way more control over public speaking than most people. Leaders elected in Western countries all need to be really good at public speaking. It's kind of like entertainment. Reagan fit what voters wanted. Some crazy female fans said they'd vote for Reagan even if he wasn't running. The other reason was that TVs were spreading everywhere. In 1950, only 4 million American homes had a TV. By 1955, 30 million homes had one. By 1960, nearly 60 million homes had a TV. Reagan benefited from TV becoming common. Television broadcasts made this good-looking guy even more appealing. This good-looking guy on TV, he could talk, so they picked him. With that one powerful speech, Reagan made an incredible comeback in politics. The Republican Party pushed him forward as their main man. In 1966, Reagan won by over 1 million votes. He beat Brown and became governor of California, serving 2 terms. In 1968, the New York Times started predicting Reagan would run for president. In August 1976, Reagan made his first attempt. In the party primary, he got 1,070 votes to Ford's 1,187. He lost by an extremely narrow margin. Then Ford lost by another tiny margin to Democrat Carter in 1977. Reagan dusted himself off and ran for president again 4 years later. In that election, the only strong opponent inside the Republican Party was George H.W. Bush. Reagan easily swept him aside with his powerful speaking skills. But Bush, even though he was losing badly, refused to give up, and that earned him respect within the party. Everyone thought, this guy is tough, a real Texan. After Reagan, we'll pick him for president. Reagan didn't like Bush much either, thought he was too stubborn and hurt party unity. But in the end, weighing the pros and cons, Reagan invited Bush to join him as vice presidential nominee to run together. When it came to the final round, Reagan's opponent was the sitting president, Carter. Carter had bad luck. He was doomed before he even started. At that time, the biggest crisis internationally was the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis in Iran. Iran thought Carter had started the Iran-Iraq War that broke out in September 1980. They believed Carter was the puppet master behind Saddam, so they wouldn't give him any face. During the election, they absolutely refused to release the hostages. Meanwhile, Reagan used his media connections to trash Carter as incompetent on TV every day. At the same time, Reagan sent people to secretly negotiate with Iran. Reagan promised that if he got into office, he would sell weapons to Iran, as long as Iran released the hostages. With Iran attacking from one side and Reagan from the other, Carter lost badly. 49 electoral votes to Reagan's 489. On the 21st of January 1981, just hours after Reagan gave his inaugural address, Iran released the American hostages they'd held for 444 days. 69 days after taking office, Reagan was leaving the Washington Hilton Hotel when someone fired 6 shots at him. One bullet hit his lung, almost killing him. The shooter was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity, but he was locked up in a mental hospital for 35 years. He wasn't allowed to leave until August 2016. The Iran thing didn't end there. On the 27th of October 1986, the editor of the Lebanese magazine Times Al-Shira Times interviewed Hashemi, the head of Iran's Islamic Liberation Movement office. That guy had a big mouth. He actually said that the US sold weapons to Iran through Israel in 1985, and that US National Security Advisor McFarlane had come to Iran in May 1986 using a fake Irish passport. In the end, Iran bought 2,000 TOW anti-tank missiles and 235 Hawk surface-to-air missiles from the US in exchange for releasing 7 American hostages captured by Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982. That was a separate hostage crisis. The Iranians took American weapons and used them to beat up the Iraqis, who the Americans were supporting. What a tangled mess. After Times Al-Shira Times exposed this, Hashemi, who blabbed to the media, was executed by Khomeini. Reagan's approval rating dropped from 67% to 46%. The Senate and House set up a special investigation committee. They traced it all the way back to 1981, right when Reagan first took office, and found he'd been selling weapons to Iran even then. Reagan sacrificed his own people to save himself. The CIA director and the National Security Advisor took the fall and resigned. Colonel North took the big fall, got 3 years in prison. In 1986, Reagan was 75. 5 years into his presidency, Gorbachev was 55, 1 year into being General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. A year earlier, they'd already met in Geneva to feel each other out. In 1986, they met in Iceland and started talking about serious stuff. The two of them were about to join hands and push the massive Soviet Union over. A lot of historians today talk about the Soviet Union and always say its collapse was inevitable and all that. I don't really agree with that. Anyone who could say in 1981 that the Soviet Union's collapse was inevitable, that would be truly impressive. Saying it was inevitable after the Soviet Union fell is like showing up at a car crash scene and saying, this car was bound to crash eventually. It's a bit like saying, I told you so. The Soviet Union collapsed in the end for 2 reasons. 1. Andropov died too soon. 2. Gorbachev was really a piece of work. If Andropov had lived about 10 more years, the Soviet Union might still be around in 2020. If Gorbachev hadn't groveled so much to the West, the Soviet Union wouldn't have collapsed so fast. Sure, the Soviet Union had plenty of problems, and those problems were bound to blow up. But Gorbachev's behavior went beyond what anyone could imagine. Americans like Reagan because he changed the dynamic from the Nixon era, where the Soviets were on offense and the US was on defense. In the few years before Gorbachev took over the Soviet Communist Party, back in 1981, the Soviet Union had shown off its terrifying military power that made the whole world tremble. In 1981, the medal-loving Brezhnev was still alive. To scare Poland and tell everyone to mind their own business in Afghanistan, on September 4, they held the largest military exercise in human history on the Baltic coast. 500,000 troops and 10,000 tanks took part in that exercise. Today, Russia has only 3,205 active tanks. The US has 8,000. But back then, the Soviet Union had 50,000 tanks. The exercise deeply shocked the NATO guests who were invited as observers. According to their estimates, the Soviet steel wave could take over all of Europe except Britain in just 7 or 8 days. American reinforcements would still be on the way, and Europe would already be swallowed by the Soviets. This Soviet tactic became totally outdated 10 years later when George H.W. Bush fought Iraq. Iraq's Soviet-style army got lost trying to fight the Americans. But back then, it was still incredibly intimidating. The whole NATO alliance was shaking in its boots. Today, NATO bullies Russia so much. That has a lot to do with the psychological trauma from back then. But beneath the Soviet Union's peak military power, huge social problems were hiding. The 1981 military exercise was just a final flash of light before the end. The Soviet Union's collapse was a total collapse, from material to ideology. From the very beginning, the Soviet Union existed in a very unique survival state, because it had created the first new political system in human history. If that path had succeeded, a lot of countries might have followed it, and then other countries would have been out of the game. So, right from birth, the Soviet Union was terrified that Western countries would destroy it. Stalin's first 5-year plan and second 5-year plan were about running barefoot like crazy to industrialize. They just finished the second 5-year plan when Hitler attacked. After fighting through World War II with incredible difficulty, the Americans started the Cold War with them. To survive, the entire Soviet industrial system had to focus on military industry, the stuff of fighting and killing. The light industry system was never fixed. After World War II ended, and the Soviet Union was stable, the US, led NATO faced off against the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. The population gap was huge. NATO always had several hundred million more people than the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact's total population was only 60 to 70% of NATO's. And with such a big gap in population and economic size, the Soviet Warsaw Pact still tried to match NATO's military spending. The Soviet Union's military power was terrifying, but its real weakness was hiding beneath the surface. It's a reminder that even the most intimidating force can collapse from within. If you like this, hit subscribe for more stories like this.